No one expected fireworks that morning in the Senate chamber. The agenda looked like any other. An education reform hearing scheduled to run its course with polished soundbites, polite disagreements, and plenty of dry data. But what unfolded instead was something raw, unexpected, and unforgettable. It was the kind of moment that didn't just trend online. It shifted perceptions and challenged assumptions in real time. At the center of it stood two people who couldn't have been more different. On one side, Senator Elizabeth Warren, a fierce progressive icon known for her precise academic arguments and cutting wit. A former Harvard professor, she walked into the chamber with statistics in one hand and a sharpened rhetorical blade in the other. On the other side, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. Folksy, unapologetically Southern, often underestimated. The tension began simmering the moment Warren took the floor. Her tone was cool and commanding, her arguments supported by charts, data, and historical references. At first, it was typical Capitol Hill fare, blame games over funding, gaps in educational access, partisan policy jabs. But then something changed. She shifted from policy to personality, from analysis to attack. Without naming him outright at first, Warren alluded to her colleague across the room, mocking what she described as the kind of folksy charm that belongs more in a duck blind than in a policy debate. The room stiffened, but she didn't stop there. Her voice grew sharper, her tone more dismissive. And then she delivered the line that would hang in the air like smoke. Frankly, she said with a smirk, it's hard to take education advice from someone who probably got their diploma out of a cereal box. The reaction was instant and silent. The entire room froze. A few of her allies chuckled softly, but the moment didn't land as a joke. It landed like a slap. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters scribbled. Aides exchanged nervous glances. And across the chamber, all eyes turned to Senator Kennedy. He didn't blink. He didn't fidget. He didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he just looked at her, calm, composed, and unreadable. But what no one in the room could have known was that behind that still expression, something was building. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something more powerful, clarity. Because John Kennedy had been here before. Mocked for his drawl. Dismissed for his plain speech. Underestimated because he didn't speak in polished Ivy League cadence. But beneath that Southern accent was a mind sharpened by decades of legal work and academic study, including time at Oxford University. Yes, that Oxford. So when he finally reached for his microphone, the room leaned in, not because they expected fireworks, but because silence often speaks louder. And Kennedy was about to remind everyone that intelligence isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it sounds like restraint. In that moment, as the cameras rolled and the tension thickened, it was no longer just a policy debate. It was a cultural reckoning. A standoff between perception and reality, style and substance, judgment and dignity. And Kennedy? He was just getting started. The silence in the chamber stretched longer than anyone anticipated. Senator Kennedy didn't rush. He didn't react. He simply leaned forward, adjusted the microphone with measured calm, and looked directly across the room. Not with anger, but with something far more disarming, certainty. "Ma'am," he began, his Southern accent rolling gently through the room like slow thunder. "I may talk like I'm from the country because I am. I was raised in Zachary, Louisiana. I've baled hay. I've cleaned fish. I've taught Sunday school. But I also went to Vanderbilt. I studied law at the University of Virginia. And I studied at Oxford. Not just passed through. Studied." The words settled heavy in the air. There was no bravado in his tone, no condescension. Just quiet power. He didn't need to yell. He wasn't playing to the cameras. He was reclaiming the room. "I didn't get my diploma from a cereal box," he added, his gaze steady. "I got it from one of the finest legal institutions in the world. And I got it the old-fashioned way, by working my tail off." Some senators shifted in their seats. A few aides looked down at their notepads. Even some of Warren's usual allies seemed taken aback, not just by the content of his words, but by the way he delivered them. Direct, human, and with absolute control. Kennedy's words weren't just a defense of his own credentials. They were a defense of every American who's ever been written off because of an accent, a background, or a zip code. Every factory worker with wisdom in their hands. Every single mother whose grit outpaces any resume. Every student who didn't attend the right school, but still learned the right lessons. "I've never understood," he continued, "why sounding like you grew up around good, honest people is somehow a liability in this town. You want to talk education? Let's talk education. But leave the cheap shots at the door. It wasn't bombastic. It wasn't flashy. But it hit like a freight train. Warren sat still, blinking. She wasn't used to being disarmed without direct confrontation. But Kennedy's style was different. He didn't attack, he illuminated. And what he revealed wasn't just about himself. It was about the unspoken classism that often lingers beneath political discourse. The assumption that intelligence must always come dressed in a certain way, spoken in a certain tone, credentialed by a certain coast. He looked around the room once more. You know, he said, smart doesn't always sound fancy. And dignity doesn't need a spotlight. You can be educated and still speak plainly. You can go to Oxford and still say y'all. That's not a contradiction. That's America. At that moment, the energy in the room shifted. Subtly, but undeniably. Some journalists stopped typing, realizing they were no longer witnessing a policy debate. They were witnessing a moment. The hearing went on, but the atmosphere had changed. Kennedy didn't grandstand. He asked thoughtful questions, listened closely to testimonies, and returned the conversation to policy with quiet authority. But the seed had been planted, and its roots were already spreading far beyond the Senate walls. What began as an attempt to humiliate turned into a masterclass in humility. What was meant to be a punchline had become a turning point. Because when John Kennedy spoke, he didn't just defend his education. He defended the principle that where you're from should never disqualify where you're going. And across the country, millions who had once felt invisible felt seen. As the hearing came to a close, there was a stillness in the room that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the usual procedural fatigue. It was a kind of collective reflection, quiet, thoughtful, a moment when even the usual posturing faded. Senator Kennedy gathered his papers, nodded respectfully to the chair, and stood. He wasn't the kind of man to bask in applause, and none was given, but the silence carried something heavier than clapping ever could: respect. Elizabeth Warren remained seated, her expression unreadable. For all her skill in debate, all her command of data and delivery, something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in the narrative. She had come in ready for a policy war. What she encountered was something deeper. A reminder that intelligence is not always loud, and dignity does not always wear designer suits. Outside the chamber, the moment exploded. Clips of Kennedy's response were cut, captioned, and shared across every major social platform. But what surprised analysts wasn't just the virality, it was the reaction. People weren't cheering for a zinger. They were responding to a truth they rarely heard spoken aloud in politics. That a person's worth is not measured by their accent, their alma mater, or their ability to quote studies, but by their integrity, their experience, and the content of their character. Veterans shared it. Farmers reposted it. Teachers from rural districts said they felt seen. People who had grown up being told they sounded too country to be taken seriously found vindication in Kennedy's calm defense. And it wasn't just conservatives. Democrats, independents, centrists, Americans of all stripes shared the moment because, regardless of political affiliation, they recognized something universal in Kennedy's words: the right to be heard without having to change who you are. Commentators on major news networks debated the exchange for days, but the message kept resurfacing. This wasn't about winning a point. This was about reclaiming dignity. For many, it wasn't even about Kennedy or Warren. It was about what they represented. Warren, for all her intelligence and advocacy, had underestimated something powerful: the weight of authenticity. And Kennedy, often underestimated himself, proved that restraint can be more potent than rhetoric. That clarity, when delivered from a place of lived experience, can shift conversations in ways no shouting match ever could. In a culture of hot takes and viral clashes, Kennedy had done something radical. He listened, responded with grace, and spoke directly to the people too often mocked in the margins. Not as a performance, but as a principle. Back in Louisiana, local news stations ran segments highlighting Kennedy's academic background: Oxford, Virginia, Vanderbilt, juxtaposed with footage of him helping rebuild storm-damaged schools and attending town hall meetings in small parishes. The man who talked country was also the man who had walked with scholars, argued in courtrooms, and never forgot where he came from. And in classrooms across the nation, young students watched the clip, some for the first time realizing that how they speak doesn't define what they can achieve. The hearing faded from the headlines, as all news cycles eventually do. But the moment remained. It was one of those rare, crystalline instances in American politics when the noise drops out and the human story takes center stage. Senator Kennedy never claimed to be perfect. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. But in that moment, he embodied something bigger than himself. He reminded the nation that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply tells the truth and lets it echo.